to make sure I get this right. Well, Mitchell of Midlothian is, I guess, a native, I guess I could call you then, of Powhatan. Was a founding member of the Powhatan Civil War Roundtable some years ago. No, her mother. I'm already just following his mother. My apologies. He graduated from Huguenot Academy and attended this little school called VMI. And long distance commercial truck driver, and has taken the opportunity to listen to many audiobooks, which is a good thing to do. And now he is focusing, researching, and writing stories on history, on people, and the events. He is currently a member of May Memorial Baptist Church and also attends St. James Baptist Church. So, welcome onto the Powhatan Civil War Roundtable. And I will turn this over to you. Hi, good evening, and thank you for coming. In starting, I would like to acknowledge my guests who have come tonight from Denver, North Carolina, which is north of Charlotte. We have George Barr, and he's a direct descendant of Frank Stringfellow, and he brought the saber that many of you had the opportunity to hold. That was one of Frank Stringfellow's sabers. It was a ceremonial saber, not a weapon of war, in case it bothered you when you hold it that way. In addition, we have Frank Stringfellow Barr, who had driven all the way here from Earlyville, Virginia. And we have Reverend William C. from Genito Presbyterian Church, and whom I claim is the most educated man in Powhatan County. We have Sandra and Daryl Kemp, and Sandra is an author and a local historian, and that is what formed our friendship. And she has come out here to support me on this in this part. My son PJ Mitchell is right here. He lives in Powhatan. And I have 4 of my VMI brother rats here to give me moral support and discipline later if needed. That's Steve Oddie, Anthony Moore, John Whitmer, and Kenneth Bly. Kenneth came all the way from Cortland, Virginia. I don't think I left anybody out. I think I got everybody. Now, how we got to where we are regarding this, okay? It started in January. I had coffee right around the corner at Rise and Shine with Billy Bolt. And at the end of our conversation, Billy said, "What do you know about Frank Stringfellow?" I said, "I don't know anything about him, but I know that the St. Luke's Historical Society wants me to write an article about him for their semi-annual newsletter, but nobody in St. Luke's knows anything about him. They just know he was famous, and they knew it because one of them had seen this book, The Stringfellow of the Fort, but didn't know the title of it. So they'd asked me to write an article, and I was one day away from telling them I'm going to write about Rex Allen because I didn't know where to start. Reverend Stringfellow, and I had no starting point. One day away when Billy Bolt goes, "Excuse me, what do you know about Frank Stringfellow?" And I said, "I don't know anything." "What do you know?" Well, Billy couldn't believe that I didn't know about Frank Stringfellow. And he told me that, he was a famous scout and a famous courier for Jeb Stuart and for Robert E. Lee. And he was also a Washington spy. And Billy said, "When you get home, Google him, because the internet is loaded with information." So I drove home. There it was, gobs of information. So I did a cut and paste, and I sent a copy of the Wikipedia article to Connie Kennan Harris, chair of the St. Luke's Historical Society, and I said, "I will write an article about Frank Stringfellow," because she had been asking me for like 2 years to do it. And I said, read this article, and you can see how famous he was, what a big deal he was. And she responded, "Well, play down about the Confederacy. We just want to know about his years in Powhatan." Well, that's like asking somebody to write an article about Tom Brady, but don't mention professional football. But I'm a dutiful servant, and I told Connie I would. Yeah, as much as I would love to tell you about all that has transpired from January to now, it's too much and we don't have enough time. But I could tell you this: it has been a labor of love absolute love. And I met a lot of friends. I made a lot of friends along the way, and I learned a tremendous amount about this man. And let me just say that the traits I admire about him were his brilliance, his quick thinking, his resourcefulness, his daring courage, his expert report writing, his stamina, and his loyalty to the cause he believed in. That's what I admire him for his 4 years as a Confederate. And that for his 40 years as a minister, I admire his deep faith, his righteous living, and his godly works. These two books were a great help to me. One was Confederate Scout by James Dudley Peavy. Wrote this in 1956, the year I was born. And this was really probably based on Stringfellow's earlier work, about 1980 work called Scout Life, which nobody, if there's a copy out there, I don't know where. But it's full of good story. You can get that off Amazon Books. This is Stringfellow the Fourth. The only way you can get that is through eBay. And I've seen prices range from $100 to $400 for this book. Mine came from the Library of Virginia. Now, I'm going to start by reading some passages that the authors have written it so much better than I could. Okay, this is Frank wrote this. I was only a private soldier for a great part of the war, and but a boy. It could not be expected that I should have done very much or known very much. What I have to communicate is almost entirely from memory. My efforts to keep a diary failed because it was often lost to the enemy. That I shall speak often of myself is because much of my experience was acquired when I was alone with God. I shall speak of things as I saw them. I was what is called in military language a scout in the Army of Northern Virginia. I began by running the gauntlet at Manassas and passed our own pickets before I attempted the enemy's. Then I ventured out of our lines little by little until I was at home in the Northern Army. General Jeb Stuart ordered me to report on detail for special duty as a scout, but also with John Mosby, who later became a partisan. For those not from Powhatan, John Mosby was born in Powhatan, but he was not a member of the Powhatan troop. My business was to get information, but my taste and tempting opportunities often led me to assume the character of a partisan. I'd often indulged in capturing picket posts, engaged in raiding parties on wagon trains, in delaying the march of an advancing column, or in seeking to surprise lightly guarded generals at headquarters where they felt secure from attack. And this is an excerpt from John Cook's The Wearing of the Grave. Frank Stringfellow occupied a position in many ways different from that of the regular Confederate soldier. Often going alone on secret missions, he was entirely on his own as there was no one near to give him orders. He depended for success on the quickness of his eye, his hand, and his wits. He was silent in his movements, low-toned in his speech, moderate in his habits. Usually he knew every road and path in the country where he started. He slept rarely in houses, preferring the woods. That was for security reasons. He would flank enemy pickets, penetrate to their camps, learn their number and position, and always on the lookout for stragglers from whom he could learn their plans. By the way, when I first started studying this, when I came across the word stragglers, I thought it meant people who were, following their army, had fallen behind. That's how I interpret stragglers. When he writes stragglers, he means guys, Yankees who have left their camps looking for blackberries, peaches, apples, chickens, eggs, garden produce. That's why they were easy pickings for a scout. If he could not flank the enemy pickets, he would charge them. And if he could not guard through the lines, he would fight through. When he related his adventures, he did so with a laugh, seeing the humorous side of affairs. His life seemed chiefly attractive to him because of this side of it, and he jested about his perils with a gay spirit that was one of his greatest charms. He had escaped from deadly peril, fooled the foe, then entertained his friends around the campfire with a humorous recital of the happenings. He worked, watched, and fought, endured hardship, and risked liberty and life hourly. If he fell, it might be in the depths of some forest, where his bones would molder away undiscovered. But while he was alive, he lived a full life. He loved his work and gave to the cause a piercing eye, a ready hand, and a daring soul. For his often invaluable service and his risk of life, night and day, if he received nothing, he was perfectly content. He had only the liberty to roam, to hunt the enemy after his own fashion, and to die in single combat, if he must, with a pistol. Now, Reverend Stringfellow, the pulpit is yours. All right. Good evening, brothers and sisters. My name is Reverend Frank Stringfellow. I was born in 1840, and I died in 1913. And I'm honored that after being dead for 112 years, you want to hear my story. Well, my grandfather was a successful Fredericksburg businessman, a merchant. And when he retired from business, he bought a big farm in Culpeper County at Raccoon Ford on the Rappahannock River, which he named the Retreat. And when he died, he left it to my father, Robert, who was one of 10. That's why there's so many Stringfellow cousins. We lived on that farm with my mother, my two older brothers, Robert, whom we called Bob, and Martin, and our one and only slave, Uncle George Campbell. Now, George was interesting because he was born free and sold into slavery, which couldn't possibly have been legal. Somehow my father acquired him, and he farmed him out or let him out for hire, which means that George was making money for himself as well as for my father. But when my father died, my brother Martin inherited the farm, and he inherited George's. And we needed George to run the farm. George was only 17 years older than I was. When he was 25, he took a wife named Lucretia, and her nickname was Liz, and we called her Liz or Mammy Liz. Now, the thing about George was that if my mother wanted a tour of the farm, she had to walk with George because he carried all the keys. Anything needed to be unlocked, George had to unlock it for her. That's how responsible that man was. He actually ran the farm. When he died in 1898 at the age of 75, a 2-column article ran in the Culpeper Star Exponent and in the Alexandria Gazette titled Noteworthy Man Died. And in it, it said that George Campbell was looked up to, that no one had ever said a discouraging word about him, that he was consulted with and loved by family. After his funeral, which was a black funeral in a black church, when they came out of the funeral service, they were greeted by another crowd of white people, and 6 white men carried his coffin to his grave, and that's where the funeral service was conducted with whites and black. So I'm bringing that up because it affected how I perceived this whole race situation. I love that man as a true uncle, not as a slave on our place, and he was part of the family. And if you asked me at any time during the Confederate War, what was I fighting for? Well, it was not for the protection and expansion of slavery. It was to protect Virginia from an army of Northern aggression. And I would say that was true of all the men I served with. Now, I started off boarding school at Charlottesville, And then I went to the Episcopal High School in Alexandria, where I finished in 1860. When the war broke out in 1861, I was teaching Latin and Greek at a girls' boarding school in Mississippi. And I rushed back to Virginia by train because I wanted to enlist like my two older brothers had already done. And I got turned down by 4 cavalry units, including the Goochland Dragoons. All right. Well, I was desperate to join. The reason why they turned me down is they said I was too small. I weighed 94 pounds, and I was a little over 5 feet tall. So I was built like a racehorse jockey. And I wanted desperately to serve, and I packed on weight, ate like a horse, and got my weight up to 110. And then I decided to try and join the Powhatan troop because they were bivouacked in Culpeper near where I was. But I knew that I had to make I had to do something dramatic for them to overlook my size. And so I tied my horse up in the woods near the camp, and I stealthily entered the woods, and I took one of their pickets prisoner. And I stood behind the tree with my gun on him, and I said, "You call the picket to your left, and you call the picket to your right to come to you, and do it regularly, and nothing will happen to you." So we called in the 2 pickets. Now I had 3. I came out behind the tree, and I made all 3 of them my prisoners, and I marched them into their own camp, see their commanding officer, who was Captain John F. Blake. He had been a Powhatan judge, worked at the courthouse right across the street, and his men had elected him their commander. And Captain Lay said, "What's the meaning of this?" And I explained to him that I'd been turned down by 4 units already, and I was trying to prove to him that I was worthy to be in the Powhatan troop if I could take 3 of his pickets prisoner. He acquiesced. I was allowed to join. That was May of 1861. I was now a member of the Powhatan troop. The Powhatan troop was an extraordinary troop, and I don't just say that because I'm Powhatan. They had been trained for 2 years prior to the war by Colonel Philip St. George Cott of Belmead Plantation, and they were well equipped and had good horses and were trained. They looked good. They looked sharp. They looked so sharp that General Beauregard, who was in charge of the whole thing at the time, made them his personal escort. So wherever he went, they went. And if he went to observe fighting at a certain place, they joined in the fight. There were 92 men altogether that served in the Powhatan troop. Of those, 46 total were either wounded or died from wounds or were killed. So that's a pretty high casualty rate, 46 out of 92. Maybe that was common. I'm not a Civil War historian. Now, when the Army was reformed, when the Confederate forces were reformed in the fall of 1861, Powhatan troop became Company E in the 4th Regiment of the Virginia Cavalry. And General Stewart had already noticed me and liked what he saw in me, probably mostly because I was built like a racehorse jockey. And he summoned me to his tent, and he offered me a position as his personal scout and courier, and explained the risks and the dangers. Well, I was honored. Of course, I said yes. And I joined a group of about 10 or 12 men who were already scouts and couriers. One of them was John Mosby of Powhatan, but not of Powhatan troop, who went on to become Colonel Mosby of Mosby Ranges. Now I can get to my exploits and my adventures, because that's what we are really here for. So one time I went out to do my scouting work, and I, did hello and goodbye to the Confederate pickets, and I went out and did my work. Now I'm coming back in the middle of the night to the same place I'd been where the rebel pickets had been, and it was like, "Halt, who goes there?" And I said, "Stringfellow of the 4th. And suddenly I had I had three carbines against me. The Unions had overrun the Confederates while I was gone, so I had walked right into Federal pickets. I had 3 guns on me. So I said, boys, you got me this time. And I took my 2 sidearms and I handed them to the man in the middle. He handed off his carbines so he could take my guns. I pulled out my Dancer. I shot her in the chest. I took back my guns. I shot the other 2 men and I raced out of there. Now, my grandchildren said I was called the Scout. That's all my descendants ever called me, the Scout. And my grandchildren, great-grandchildren said, Scout, did you kill many Yankees during the Civil War? And my answer was always, I hope not. And I meant that sincerely. Now, another adventure was our home, the retreat, was right on the Raccoon Ford on the Rappahannock River. It was obvious that at some point that was going to be the site of a military confrontation, and it was. Our house was right in the middle of firings taking place. The house received 1,000 balls, and 5 shells went through it. My mother was outside doing chores. And that was my mother for you. And she received a bullet passed through her foot. They carried her to another building which was being used as headquarters by the Yankees. Well, I told Judge Stewart, sir, I want to go visit my mother. I want to go visit my mother in the second floor bedroom of the house that was being used as headquarters by the Yankees. And General Stewart said, I can't let you go on a mission like that. That's too risky. You could easily die. I would be irresponsible. But I tell you what, I want you to go to that place and I want you to find out every single thing you can about the Union forces in that location. So what he was actually doing was giving me permission to do whatever I wanted. And I found the house all right. And I waited outside, and I knew at some point either George or Lish was going to have to come outside. And when they did, I whispered to them, this is Frank. I'm here to see my mother. I want you to bring me out one of her gowns and a long-eared bonnet. And so I snuck back in the house with Lish. And when the soldier at the door said, who's this? Lish said, oh, the missus has taken a turn for the worse, and I've brought in some help to help me with her. So he let us through. And I attended to my mother in her bedroom for 3 days. Whenever a Federal came in, I hid in the closet. And then I left the same way I'd entered when it was time to go. And by the way, I was full of military intelligence that I gathered from listening to the folks downstairs talk. And Judge Stewart was delighted to see me return unharmed and full of valuable information. Another interesting experience was I was actually resting in the home of friends named the Stingers near Bull Run Mountain in Fauquier County when somebody let them know that Frank Stringfellow the Scout was in this house. And so I was enjoying their company when I heard galloping horses come out and looked out the window, and there's federal cavalry coming up. And they went to the front door and the back door at the same time. I couldn't escape. So I looked around and said, where can I hide? Where can I hide? And the servant girl, Martha, suggested that I hide in the garret upstairs. So I climbed the ladder, which is an attic. And I looked around. It was empty. There was nothing in there. And I said to Martha, where am I going to hide? She said, lay on one of those boards over the rafters. There were 2 boards over the rafters in the east. Still lay on top of one of them. So I did it. I was out of options. And I thought, I can still be seen. So I had my guns drawn, and I was prepared to shoot my way out or die trying. Well, she went downstairs, and pretty soon she came back upstairs leading a Federal soldier who wanted to inspect the garret. Well, Martha held her candle directly underneath the board I was lying on, such that the board's shadow kept me in shadow. I realized what she was doing. It was ingenious. And I said to myself, she has saved my life. I owe her a debt, and I will repay the debt. And I'll come to repaying that debt later on in the story. Um, Here's another little tale. I captured a federal cavalry officer way outside of where he should have been. He was all by himself. And I searched this person, and he was carrying on him an invitation to a dance in the Opera House at Brandy Station. And I asked him about the invitation, and he wouldn't really give me an answer. But I kept the invitation, and I sent him on as a prisoner of war. But I knew the girl whose name was on the invitation, and I went to see her, and I showed her, explained how I came upon this invitation, and said, "Were you planning to go to that dance?" And she said, "Oh, no." I said, "Well, why would he be inviting you?" She said, "Well, I went to them because my brother is a POW, and I wanted to find out some information about him, and this officer went to a lot of effort to help me." I could sort of tell that they had become sweet on each other, which is all right. But I said, "Will you mind if I went in your place?" And she said, "No." So she and her mother dressed me up in her gown, and they patted me where I needed to be patted, and I passed for a girl. Her father drove us in his buggy up to the Union picket line, and then let me take it from there, and he walked back home. So I go to the dance, dressed as a girl, and I'm chatting up the officers. I didn't dance because it's easy for a man to dance when he's the lead, but it's like impossible for him to dance when he's not the lead. So I didn't dance because I would have given it all up. But I was gathering Nurka information for these officers who were just full of themselves. Well, one girl of the dance told her escort, "That's not a girl. That's Frank Stringfellow." So that officer told me he wanted to talk to me privately outside. And outside, he confronted me with what he had just been told. And I said, "Sir, if you will turn your back for just 1 minute, when you turn around, I will reveal to you whether I am a man or woman." And this sounded like an inviting proposition to this man. So he turned around. When he turned back around 1 minute later, I stuck a derringer in his side. Said, "Sir, you are now my prisoner." I was wearing pants under my gown, and I had my derringer stuck in my belt. Says, "You are now my prisoner, and you're going to escort me out of here." So we got in my buggy, and we went past the Union picket lines, and the Union pickets were delighted to let this federal officer go with his girl. And when we got to the rebel picket lines, I turned him over as a prisoner of war, and I returned the buggy and returned the gown. So being so small, I could pass for a woman, and I had a fair complexion. Now, this comes to my last exhilarating story. Okay. Because of lack of time. I met with President Jefferson Davis and with Judah Benjamin, the Secretary of State, on March 3rd. And they sent me on my most dangerous and most desperate mission and important mission. Now, when you were in high school studying history, you were probably told that John Wilkes Booth was a lone wolf. That is not true. He was part of a Washington network of Confederate spies, and he had a leadership position. John Wilkes Booth had what sounds like a ludicrous idea, but it wasn't. It was sound. And that was to capture President Lincoln, hold him hostage, and get him to Richmond. Now, there's only like 6 weeks left of the war, but nobody actually knew that. All they knew is that things were extremely grim for the South. That was John Wilkes' plan. And why it was sound was because President Lincoln was in the habit of leaving Washington on a Friday evening by carriage to go to the soldiers' home, which was 5 miles outside of Washington, to escape his generals, the bureaucrats, the legislators, the press, the mobs, and most of all, Mrs. Lincoln. And he was in an enclosed carriage so that people couldn't go, oh, there goes President Lincoln. And he had a small security escort so it would not draw attention. So John Wilkes Booth's plan was to jump the security detail, take President Lincoln hostage, and don their uniforms and drive their carriage to Southern Maryland, where they had the means by which to get to Virginia and from Virginia to Richmond. I believe that, Paul Mitchell believes that when Frank Stringfellow left that office, my job was to expedite John Wilkes Booth's plan and to be in charge of the escort back to Richmond. So again, very important, very dangerous, and desperate. Well, I hoped to get there on inauguration day, but I was one day late. And I walked up the steps to the White House. I understand you can't do that anymore. And I spit on the White House to show as an expression of my contempt for the man who occupied the presidency. I'll later change my feelings about him. And then I secured housing in a hotel that was also occupied by Vice President Andrew Johnson. What my objective was to get as close as I could to an official close to Lincoln who could tell me when Lincoln was going to go to the soldiers' home, what time they were going to leave, what route they would take, and how many would be in the security detail. Okay, I have 10 minutes to go. All right. So, wow. All right. So, I had money to expedite that. Now, my cover was that I was studying to pass a dental certification. After passing it, I would be a dentist and I would be free to roam Maryland looking for dental patients. That was my cover, but it was real. I actually was studying, and I earned that certificate before I had to leave Washington. Anyway, I found what I thought was the right guy. I propositioned him with money for that information I just offered you. And when I called on him at his office, I found that he was in a huddle with high-ranking Army officers. And I knew, he has told on me. My ship is sunk. I got to get out of Washington. And John Wilkes Booth helped me get 12 miles outside of Washington using his carriage because the Pinkerton detectives were looking for a spy who was imposing as a dentist. He dropped me off. I now have, I was in Southern Maryland and I needed to get further Southern Maryland. So I hired a hack and a driver, and we were going along at night when our reins were grabbed and there were 4 men with arms and they demanded my papers. And I explained that I was a dentist going to see patients. Well, they all smiled at one another because that's exactly who they were looking for. And I was taken to, they led me to the lieutenant's headquarters in charge of the security forces in that area. Well, while I was riding in my hack by myself with these riders around their carriage, I started eating my papers, all the papers I had on me that could give me up, but I forgot one. It was in a pocket. I forgot about it. And so when I met Lieutenant Lafferty, they searched me. They found a letter addressed to a Confederate officer. So, they knew I was the spy they were looking for. I was arrested and I was sent to a jail in my same hack now. But now I've got a guard named Green who's with me. And on the way, I suggested we stop in an ordinary to get dinner, my treat. Uh, he had his Green had his back to the fire. Several times I got up to stoke the fire, but what I was really doing was eyeballing the axe beside the fire because I thought I have to escape. And the only way I can escape is to bury this axe in his head and make a run for it. But I just couldn't do it. He was a good man. I just couldn't kill him to fuel my escape. So I let him live. When we got to the jail, I asked to speak with Green privately. We stepped away from the jail. I said, "Sir, if you will just turn your back to me and allow me 10 strides before you notice I'm gone, I will give you $500. He said, "Do you have it on you?" I said, "No, but I'll get it to you." He said, "No, I can't do that." He said, "Are you a Mason?" And I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "Well, that's too bad because if you're a Mason and if you could give me the first sign, I would let you go. The oath the Masons have for one another exceeds other oaths, according to Green." I said, "I'm not a Mason, but I appeal to your Christianity. It's one Christian to another. Just turn your head and let me get 10 strides away before you sound the alarm." He said, "I can't do that." So we were going back to the jail building, and he said, "Tomorrow morning, they're going to escort you back to Washington where you will be executed. The only way you can live is if you escape tonight." So I resolved to escape by any means necessary. I was not able to do it that night, but the trip to Washington was postponed for a day. The second night, the two guards fell asleep. So the building was actually unlocked. The two guards slept with their beds in a V. Well, they weren't supposed to sleep, but they were on benches. And they fell asleep in that position. You couldn't get to the door without crawling over them. Well, I leapt over one in my stocking feet to make no noise, but my heel hit the heel of one guard and woke up and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm running a fever. I needed a drink of water." All right, all right. So I took a drink of water and I opened the door and tossed out the remaining from the tent. And I closed it with a loud sound, but then I pushed it out a little bit. And I used the shadow from the lamp to hide that there was a gap between the door and the frame. And I went back to bed and I waited until they started snoring again. This time when I leaped, I didn't hit him. When I opened the door, I flung myself out. So I'm running in bare feet and the ground is muddy. So I'm leaving footprints behind. And when I got to a brook, I ran along in the brook where I wasn't leaving any footprints. I'm so out of time. Okay. So now I needed to get to the other side of the brook without showing footprints. And what I was looking for was a branch low hanging, and I finally found one on a birch tree. And I climbed up the branch into the May tree and then walked out on a branch toward the high side and jumped onto a steep bank where there was a big fat log. And I lay down on the upside side of the log and covered myself in leaves. Well, all day long they looked for me, and I never moved a muscle. All day long I never moved a muscle, because if I had, the leaves might have shifted and revealed myself to them. So when dark came, I took off again. It took me 21 days to reach Virginia. And when I reached Virginia, I found out, one, that Lincoln had surrendered. Two, that did I say Lincoln? I meant Lee. Lee had surrendered. Lincoln had been assassinated. I was considered by the press as the most dangerous man in the Confederacy because they thought I was involved with Lincoln's assassination. And fourthly, that there was a $10,000 bounty on my head. So I fled to Canada. A year and a half later, I returned. I farmed, but I had a religious epiphany when I was in Canada. And I said, my life has been spared for a reason. All the gunfights, all the near captures, all the captures, the escapes, I should have been dead, but I'm still alive. There has to be for a reason. So I said, it's to serve God. And so I studied for and was entered the Episcopal Seminary of Virginia, which is now called the Virginia Theological Seminary. Graduated in 1876. And my first job was here in Powhatan. I was the rector of 5 churches: Mannequin, St. Luke's, Emmanuel, Grace on Janitor Road, and St. James of Michelin. But in addition, according to what the bishop wrote in his books, I conducted services at 4 Cumberland churches that had no rector, and the bishops wrote that they would have closed without me. And in addition to that, I preached at St. James Baptist Church. My friend Abel Harris told me, Paul's friend Abel Harris told him that St. Luke's provided a rector for St. James before they had their own. And I took the bishop there to preach after he had done some confirmations at St. Luke's. And he talked about, that this was a large black church and that I preached there regularly. Now, I started the Martha Senior School for Colored Girls at St. James Baptist Church. And that was to repay the debt to Martha for saving my life. I'm sure that school went out of existence when I moved on in 1882. But I did start it, and I talked about it in some of my lectures. Now, when I was here in Powhatan, I received a letter from President Jefferson Davis, who was writing his memoirs, and he asked me to contribute something. Well, the last time I'd seen him was March 3rd, when he sent me on this important mission. I never gave him a report, so I wrote a 16-page report on that last mission, and I shared it with other people before I mailed it off to him. And the people I shared it with said, "Oh my God, this is hot. This is great. This is great. You should write a book." So I wrote a booklet called Stout Life, which was wildly successful. It sold for 50 cents a copy, and it was making a lot of money. I did not keep the money for myself, but I used it to help establish poor little churches. Well, that led to a lecture as a lecturer, a career as a lecturer. And I lectured throughout Virginia, in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., 2 cities in Kentucky, and Atlanta. It was just like one lecture after another. Now, as a lecturer, I think you would understand. Are you familiar with Jerry Clowers? Okay. And Garrison Keillor? Envision me as one of them. So I told my tales, but in a way that made people laugh. They laughed and laughed and laughed. But as a sermonizing minister, picture Billy Graham, because I was that kind of a minister. I preached repent and damnation and that sort of thing. And I was considered a rainmaker by the bishop because I could bring in crowds, I could raise money in churches, I could increase membership, I could increase confirmation numbers, increase baptism numbers, and so I was a rainmaker. In 1882, he appointed me evangelist at large for $1,000 a year, which gave me kind of a license to go not to the affluent churches and live a comfortable lifestyle, but what I wanted was the challenge. I wanted the mission churches and to build them up. And he gave me permission to do that. And I'm really running out of time, so I just want to touch on 2 more things that are interesting. I can't cover the whole rest of his career. It's too much. When I was a rector of the Nelson Parish, which included all of Nelson County plus parts of Amherst, and I preached at 10 different locations. I conducted services at 10 different locations in the Nelson Parish. My son Martin wanted to join the army to go fight in the Spanish-American War, which started and ended in 1898. Well, I wanted to go with Martin. I knew war is hell, and I just wanted to be with my son when he went off to fight in this war. So I applied to be a chaplain and I was rejected because of my age. I was 57. Well, I had a I had something on my sleeve, if you will. I during this when I was operating as spy in Washington, at one point I found myself standing behind General Grant, and he was talking to another person, and I overheard the whole conversation to the right behind them. I did not shoot General Grant in the back, though I could have, and I could have made an escape because I did not shoot men in the back. And I wrote President Grant a letter telling him about this incident, and he recalled it, and he thanked me for not shooting him in the back. And he said, I owe you a favor. Anything you ever need, just ask. Well, I wrote President McKinley, and I told him about this exchange of letters I'd had with President Grant, who said, if you ever need a favor, ask. I said, I'm asking you to honor President Grant's offer and allow me to join the Army as a chaplain, which he did. So now my son and I are going off for war together. Our first camp was on Forest Hill. I never knew there was anything like that there. But that's where we initially trained and gathered the regiments. I was chaplain of the 4th Regiment of the Virginia Infantry Volunteers. From there, we took trains down to Jacksonville, Florida, but we were held in reserve. The regular troops were fighting in Cuba. And when the war was over, the regular troops, I think, went to the Philippines, and we volunteers were then sent to Cuba as an occupying force. But I didn't stay long because in 1900, I was in Richmond for the wedding of my daughter. And then I became chaplain of Woodbury Forest School for a couple of years. That was founded by my cousin, Robert Stringfellow Walker, Captain Robert Stringfellow Walker, who had served with Mosby and Mosby's Rangers. He founded Woodbury Forest School. I was their first chaplain. I was wildly popular with the students, and that's because I told my stories in the Sacred Studies class, and I gave almost everybody 100% on their grades. Now, so my last church was St. John's Chapel in Louisa County. By the time I was 73 years old, I never quit. I was still working full time when I died, and I could not conduct services anymore standing up. I had to sit in the chair. Now, when I gave lectures, there was a little bit of preaching in my lectures. The people didn't come to hear preaching. They came to hear the stories. But as an Episcopal minister, I had to do a little preaching. And my message was that to seek forgiveness, you have to start with a contrite heart. And you seek forgiveness with a contrite heart. And then by faith, you claim forgiveness. And then you prove yourself anew in Christ by your righteous living and by your good deeds. When I was giving these lectures, our nation was still divided, and I was trying to help heal the nation. And forgiveness heals all wounds, all injury. Forgiveness. That is the end of my talk. Paul Mitchell, you can take it over. Thank you very much, Reverend Stringfellow. Just to conclude, the Stringfellow project is still active. One is that our delegate Lee Ware has agreed to sponsor a Virginia Joint House resolution, and that'll be in the 2026 Virginia General Assembly. And the original will be framed and will hang on the walls of this restaurant. The copies will go out to the Stringfellow descendants, the schools, and the churches who have expressed interest. And one more interesting thing is that one of the Stringfellow descendants gave a box of sermons from Frank Stringfellow and from his son-in-law, Reverend William Alexander Barr, to Grace Church Masters Mill in Nelson County. I said, look, that's gold. And you really need to publish them, at least publish a book of his death sermons. They're handwritten, which is a challenge. But right now, Nathan Madison with the Diocese of Virginia is digitizing them, which is the first step in that whole process. That's all I have to say. I want to thank you very much for inviting me. This has been an honor for me. And just thank you for coming and allowing me to tell Frank's story as I think he would have liked his story told. I hope into the building. Big thought. I will have some of the stuff around table. We'll give you a mug. Thank you, sir. No, I hope you'll remember us when you use it. I sure will. And I'm joining this thing. Actually, I don't have to. I haven't filled out a form yet, but I'm your newest member. Yeah. Nah, yeah. Want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and we'll see you next month. Have a safe trip home.